Welcome to UK Property Info. Today we need to have an honest conversation about something that is reshaping British society in ways that will echo for generations. UK homeownership is slipping out of reach for millions of people, and the speed at which this is happening has accelerated dramatically in recent years. This is not a distant problem affecting other people somewhere else. This is happening to your children, your friends, your colleagues, and perhaps even to you right now. Before I take you through what is really happening and why the situation has become so severe, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you find this analysis valuable. I am trying to build a community of people who want honest information about the UK property market, not the sugar-coated narratives you hear elsewhere. And every subscription genuinely helps this channel grow. Now let me show you the reality of what is happening to home ownership in this country and why the traditional path to owning your own home has become virtually impossible for millions of ordinary working people. The headline statistics are stark enough on their own. The average UK house price now stands at approximately 9 times the average UK salary. To put that in perspective, when the baby boomer generation were buying their first homes in the 1970s and 1980s, the ratio was typically between 3 and 4 times salary. A home that might have cost £12,000 when the average salary was £4,000 is the historical norm this country was built on. Today, that same relationship would mean an average home costing around £120,000 on an average salary of £35,000. Instead, the average home costs over £300,000. That gap between what should be affordable and what actually exists represents the broken promise of home ownership for an entire generation. It is not a small discrepancy. It is a chasm that has fundamentally altered what is possible for ordinary, working families in this country. The deposit barrier alone has become insurmountable for most first-time buyers, saving from their own income. The average first-time buyer deposit in the UK now exceeds £60,000, and in London and the South East it regularly exceeds £100,000. Consider what this means in practical terms. If a young person starts saving at age 22 after university, putting away £500 per month, which is an extremely ambitious savings rate for someone on a typical graduate salary, while also paying rent and living costs, they would take 10 years to save a £60,000 deposit. By that calculation, they would be 32 before they could even apply for a mortgage, assuming house prices had not risen further during that decade of saving. Of course, house prices do continue rising in most years, meaning the deposit target keeps moving further away, even as people save towards it. This is the cruel mathematics that traps millions in permanent renting. The generational shift in home ownership rates tells the story more clearly than any individual statistic. In 1991, 67% of people aged between 25 and 34 owned their own home. By 2023, that figure had collapsed to below 40%. For those in their early to mid-20s, ownership rates have fallen to under 20%. These are not minor fluctuations. They represent a fundamental transformation in how British people live. An entire generation that expected to follow the same path as their parents, buying a starter home in their 20s, trading up as their family grew, building equity and security over time, has found that path blocked entirely. The expectation of home ownership that previous generations took for granted has become an impossible dream for millions of young adults working full-time in decent jobs. This is historically unprecedented in modern Britain. The regional dimension makes the national picture even more concerning. London has become essentially closed to first-time buyers without either family wealth or exceptionally high incomes. The average London house price exceeds £500,000, requiring deposits of £75,000 to £100,000 and household incomes well into 6 figures to afford mortgage payments. But this is no longer just a London problem. Cities that were once considered affordable alternatives, Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, Leeds, have all seen prices surge beyond what local wages can support. Even areas traditionally considered cheap have experienced dramatic price increases during and after the pandemic. Young people who thought they could solve the affordability crisis by moving to lower-cost regions have found those regions are no longer low cost. The escape routes have been progressively closed off, leaving fewer and fewer places where ordinary incomes can support home purchase. Interest rates have added another layer of difficulty on top of already stretched affordability. During the period from 2009 to 2021, ultra-low interest rates of 1 to 2% partly offset high house prices by keeping monthly payments manageable. Someone buying at 10 times their salary with a 2% mortgage rate could potentially afford the monthly payments even if the purchase price seemed absurd. That crutch has now been kicked away. Mortgage rates rose from below 2% to over 5% in the fastest increase in decades. For a £300,000 mortgage, the difference between 2% and 5% interest rates adds roughly £500 per month to payments, or £6,000 per year. This has pushed millions of potential buyers who are already stretching to afford purchase firmly into unaffordability. The mathematics that barely worked at 2% rates completely breaks down at 5%. The rental trap has become one of the most pernicious aspects of the homeownership crisis. High rents make it impossible to save the deposit needed to escape high rents. A typical renter in a major city might pay £1,500 to £2,000 per month in rent. After tax, transport costs, utilities, food and other essentials, there is often little or nothing left to put towards a deposit. Many renters are effectively running on the spot, paying more in rent than a mortgage on the same property would cost, but unable to access that mortgage because they cannot save the required deposit while paying that rent. This creates a two-tier system where those who already own property or have family wealth to provide deposits can access the cheaper monthly costs of ownership, while those without such advantages are trapped paying more for less security indefinitely. The system punishes people for not already having wealth. The Bank of Mum and Dad has become one of the largest mortgage lenders in the country, and this development highlights how home ownership has become dependent on inherited wealth rather than earned income. Over half of first-time buyers under 35 now receive financial help from family members, with the average family contribution exceeding £25,000. For those without wealthy parents or grandparents able to provide deposits or act as guarantors, the route to ownership is largely closed regardless of their income or work ethic. Two people with identical jobs, identical salaries, and identical potential as mortgage payers will have completely different housing outcomes based purely on whether their families have wealth to transfer. This represents a fundamental shift from a society where hard work could buy you a home to one where family background determines your housing destiny. The meritocratic promise of home ownership has been broken. The cost of living crisis has intensified every aspect of the affordability problem. Energy bills doubled in many cases. Food inflation hit double digits. Transport costs rose sharply. Council tax increased. Everything that people need to pay for before they can think about saving for a house has become more expensive. The squeeze on household budgets has made deposit saving even harder for those who are already struggling. Many people who are making slow progress towards their deposit goal have seen that progress reversed as they dipped into savings to cover increased living costs. The crisis has pushed home ownership further away at the exact moment when people needed progress towards their goal to maintain hope. For many young adults, the cost of living crisis was the final blow that made them abandon the home ownership dream entirely. The impact on society extends far beyond individual disappointment about not owning a home. Declining home ownership affects family formation, as people delay having children because they feel unable to provide stable housing. It affects geographic mobility, as people become trapped in expensive rental markets near their jobs, rather than being able to buy in more affordable areas. It affects retirement security, as a generation that does not build housing equity will face old age without the assets that previous generations relied upon. It affects wealth inequality, as the gap between those who own property and those who do not widens with every year of house price growth. It affects mental health, as the stress of housing insecurity and the grief of abandoned dreams takes its psychological toll. This is not just a housing crisis, it is a social crisis, with consequences that will unfold over decades. The government response to declining home ownership has been inadequate at best and counterproductive at worst. Schemes like Help to Buy injected additional demand into an already supply-constrained market, pushing prices higher rather than making homes more affordable. Stamp duty holidays created short-term frenzies that again pushed prices up. The fundamental issue of insufficient housing supply relative to demand has never been seriously addressed. Britain has built far fewer homes than required for decades, and the gap between homes needed and homes built has widened rather than narrowed. Planning reform has been promised repeatedly, but has never materialised at the scale required. The political system has proved incapable of confronting the vested interests that benefit from high house prices and restricted supply. Existing homeowners vote in higher numbers than aspiring homeowners, and politicians respond accordingly. The private rental sector has expanded to absorb those locked out of ownership, but this has created its own problems. Rental security in England remains among the weakest in Europe, with no-fault evictions leaving tenants vulnerable to displacement with minimal notice. Rental costs have surged as demand has increased and supply has been constrained by landlord exits. The quality of rental housing varies enormously, with limited enforcement of standards in the lower end of the market. Renting that might be acceptable as a short-term arrangement in your 20s becomes increasingly problematic as a permanent housing solution, particularly for families with children who need stability and schools or for older renters facing insecure housing in retirement. The expansion of private renting has not provided an adequate alternative to the ownership that it has replaced. It has created new problems alongside the old ones. For those still trying to achieve home ownership, the strategies that remain are increasingly difficult or involve significant trade-offs. Buying with partners or friends to pool resources creates legal complexity and relationship risk. Buying in cheaper regions means sacrificing career opportunities and social connections in more expensive areas. Shared ownership provides a foot on the ladder, but with restricted rights and complex resale arrangements. Buying smaller properties, or those needing significant work, means compromising on immediate living standards in hope of future appreciation. Extended mortgages over 35 or even 40 years reduce monthly payments but increase total interest paid and delay the point at which the owner is truly secure. Every option available involves compromises and risks that previous generations did not have to accept. There are no good solutions remaining, only less bad ones. The situation for different groups varies significantly, but is concerning across almost all demographics. Young professionals in cities face the most extreme affordability challenges, but often have the highest incomes with which to eventually save deposits if they can control costs ruthlessly. Young people in lower wage areas face lower prices, but proportionately lower incomes, meaning affordability ratios remain stretched. Key workers like nurses, teachers, and police officers find themselves unable to afford homes in the communities they serve, creating recruitment and retention challenges for essential services. Single people face particular difficulty as they cannot share costs with a partner, meaning solo first-time buyers have become increasingly rare outside family wealth transfers. The only groups for whom home ownership remains readily accessible are those with substantial family wealth and those with exceptionally high incomes, and even those groups face stretched affordability by historical standards. Looking forward, there is little reason for optimism that the situation will improve significantly without major policy changes. House prices would need to fall dramatically relative to incomes for affordability to return to historical norms, and such falls would create their own problems for existing owners and the broader economy. Incomes would need to rise far faster than inflation for extended periods to close the gap from the other direction, and that seems unlikely given broader economic headwinds. Interest rates may fall somewhat from current levels, providing some relief, but are unlikely to return to the near zero levels that partly masked affordability problems in previous years. Housing supply increases would help over time, but take years to build to sufficient scale and face ongoing political and planning obstacles. The honest assessment is that for most people currently priced out of ownership, the situation is unlikely to improve substantially during their prime home buying years. For those watching who are trying to navigate this difficult landscape, my practical advice is necessarily limited by the severity of the structural problems involved. If home ownership is your goal, ruthless focus on deposit accumulation is essential, which may mean living arrangements and lifestyle choices that previous generations would have found extreme. Exploring all available schemes, however imperfect, makes sense when the alternative is no access to ownership at all. Considering geographic flexibility opens options that fixation on a single location closes off. Being realistic about the timeline, which may extend well into your 30s, even with aggressive saving, helps manage expectations and reduces the psychological toll of apparent failure. For some people, accepting that ownership may not be achievable and focusing on making long-term renting work as well as possible may ultimately be the healthier adjustment, however disappointing that feels. This is the reality of UK homeownership in the mid-2020s. The dream that defined British aspirations for generations has slipped out of reach for millions of people through no fault of their own. Young people who have done everything right, worked hard, studied, built careers, saved what they could, still find themselves unable to achieve what their parents took for granted. The system has broken, and those who broke it through decades of underbuilding, through policies that inflated demand without addressing supply, through protection of existing wealth at the expense of future generations, show no urgency about fixing it. The people paying the price are those with the least power to change things and the most to lose from their continuation. That is where we are. Understanding this reality clearly is the first step toward either navigating within it or demanding the political changes necessary to alter it. Thank you for watching UK Property Info. If you found this analysis valuable, please share it with others who need to understand what is really happening to home ownership in this country, and I will see you in the next video.